Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Fifi Peters. It's Jack Ma's birthday today, and the 54-year-old executive chairman and founder of the Chinese internet giant Alibaba has disclosed that he will step down from his post within a year. With a personal net worth of about $36 billion, he is planning to devote his energies to philanthropy, and Africa could benefit from his early retirement.
Africa is a continent full of opportunities. And I was inspired and I said, from now on, every year I will come to Africa, visit the 3 countries. So this is my second trip to Africa. And I hope in next 10-15 years, I can finish visiting 54 countries in Africa, every country.
Later, our panel will discuss renewable energy and why there is a slow uptake by African governments to embrace the sector and the jobs bonanza that it promises. And hidden within the dire news that South Africa has entered a recession is the bleak statistics of a nearly 30% decline in agricultural production in the second quarter. In Commodities Corner, we ask why. Now, the suspicions that China is luring African countries into a debt trap to then assume control of vital assets if countries default on their loan agreements is gaining traction. According to a report by the authoritative journal Africa Confidential, Zambia is in talks to cede control of its national power grid to China as compensation for an expected loan repayment default. Joining us to discuss the issue is political analyst Mandla Matshika. Mandla, thanks so much for your time. I mean, what do you make of what is going on with the Chinese and Zambia's electricity company?
All right, thanks. Firstly, good day and thanks for having me. Yes, getting straight to it, while there's been rumors circulating that China is in some way colonizing Africa and exploiting Africa for various reasons possible, as we see with ZESCO, which is the country's biggest national asset. I mean, you can imagine if you're providing electricity for over 80% of the population of that country. We're speaking large numbers, and there's a lot at stake with this. So, furthermore, now the major issue at hand is that should this happen, what is it at stake for the Zambian authorities as a whole? We speak of job issues, we speak of Chinese personnel, we speak of various other possibilities, such as the Chinese looking even further, branching further into the African market, so to say. So this is just another platform for the Chinese to exercise and dominate their power.
I mean, in all fairness, it's like you and I, if we go to a bank and we loan some money because we want to buy a car, a house, whatever, we sign the terms and conditions of that loan, and we know that if we don't make good on that loan payment, the bank has the right to take its assets back. Chinese did the same. Zambia went to the Chinese, asked for money. Now they've defaulted. Is China supposed to just sit back because they're also at a loss here? They have to
you know, this is another typical sad story of the fisherman throwing in the bait and the fish finding it too hard to resist. Then again, we may argue that were the Chinese aware in some way or another that Zambia weren't going to be able to pay it back. I mean, as you can imagine, we're speaking of a country here that's rated number 85 out of a total of 190 countries, according to the ease of doing business from the World Bank. So one may also argue that, but were the Chinese actually right enough to actually give them the loan, knowing very well that they're still a small and developing economy? So maybe by then they should have rather restricted or maybe just limited the loans in such a way that they can actually get the money back in smaller portions, so to say, and build up from that.
Sure. I mean, so everybody's looking at this, particularly here in South Africa, and thinking, oh boy, what is the risk that Eskom could follow suit and the Chinese could do the same? Because we do know Eskom's balance sheet is not healthy at all.
Yes, and that's another issue of concern. But however, with reference to ZESCO in Zambia, that would be a decision that would need to be vetted upon by the cabinet and the various ministers along with that. So by far and large, you would argue Is South Africa also heading for the same thing? Huge possibility, yes, very much so.
So basically you're saying that in doing relations with the Chinese, African governments need to be very careful, because if ZESCO does actually get taken back, this could set quite a big precedent.
True. I mean, look, for instance, we see that in most African nations, the problem is not with minerals or resources and the works. The major problem with African states is infrastructural development. We lack infrastructural development, which is why it's so easier for investors from outside to just come and set up firms regarding the mining industry, automotive industry, and so forth. So one of the compelling issues that we need to look at as a country and as continent moving forward is to rather look within the continent. Investors within the continent come together. Let's see what all these major economies within the continent can fork out, and then we take it from there.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time. That, of course, was political analyst Mandla Matshika. Africa's biggest economy is encountering serious economic headwinds. With the currency in turmoil and the very real threat of South Africa's credit rating being downgraded to junk status, there's even more bad news. South Africa's agricultural sector appears to be in trouble. Joining us to discuss the sector's outlook is Absa Bank's senior agricultural economist, Wessel Lemmer. Wessel, thanks so much for your time. I mean, agriculture is now the big talking point, given that it was the main reason why the economy slipped into a recession in the second quarter, technical recession. I mean, what's going on in that sector? Is it indeed in trouble?
Good day, Fifi. I think we must keep some perspective on the numbers. If you look at the 27 contribution agriculture made to GDP, it was a outstanding year. So in the first 2 quarters of 2018, the contribution of agriculture to GDP came down significantly, but it came down from a very high level. So from a very high level to a lower level. Now what caused that? First of all, the contribution of agriculture in the Western Cape is about 22% of our agricultural GDP. We had a severe drought in the Western Cape, so fruit production is down, wine production is down, all the most important export commodities is, and products is down, so that make a big contribution. And then we must also realize that over that period the rand also strengthened, so it made the export earnings less. We produced a surplus crop in this specific year for the marketing year, which is, compared to 2017, we produced a maize crop of 17 million tons. It came down to 13 million tons, which is about normal because that's our demand, so it's not a bad year. But because of the late plantings in the summer production areas, we saw that producers didn't sell, or there was a delay in the delivery of maize, the pricing of maize in the trade. So we have this huge surplus that is not priced, not going through the trading channels, so that also makes a contribution. So
are we essentially expecting a pick-up in the agricultural sector's contribution to GDP in the third quarter then?
Well, in the third quarter it will be the decline will be less, but we will see a pickup in the fourth quarter, because in the fourth quarter normally you have the GDP, or the gross producer value of animal products, is very strong in the fourth quarter.
Sure.
In the second and the third quarter it is maize, the grain and oilseeds. We will see a pickup in those in the third quarter, because we have a weaker rand. We have better export prices. We have the surplus that we can export that will contribute. So there will definitely be a pickup. But I expect that in the first quarter and the second quarter of 2019 that we will see a significant impact. Remember, there's also other aspects that make a contribution to the lower GDP, gross producer value.
Sure.
We don't talk about game. Game prices came down tremendously. We have also the vegetable prices. The vegetable production was impacted negatively by this drought. There's other factors that also contribute
to the thing that we don't talk about. But one factor that we are talking about a lot more is this issue of the land debate and expropriation without compensation and what it means. Today we've got the business confidence in the agricultural sector coming out, showing that farmers are very concerned about this. I mean, to what degree is this also a risk for the sector as a whole?
See, that confidence index was determined in August. And it was determined in the time period where we have this public hearings. And if you listen to those public hearings, we don't acknowledge the contribution agriculture and producers make to food security. It's experience, knowledge, things like that produce food. It's not actually land. You need land, you need the room to produce. But it's actually those, and if you listen to those hearings, it was actually very negative. Although, if you look at the parliament hearings, you listen to the parliament hearings, you will note that the majority of the submissions was actually against expropriation without compensation. So I think from now on, I think we reach a low point in August, and from now on it will increase. From the bank side, we encourage producers to continue reinvest in agriculture and not to let agriculture down, because if you do that, you are actually going to fall behind your competitors overseas, in our overseas markets and also locally. And it's only you and me that are going to suffer and they're going to pay more for food. For
sure. Wessel, I hope that your economic crystal ball is accurate and indeed we do recover from here. But that's where we'll leave it. That was Wessel Lemmer, who works at Absa Bank as the Agricultural Economist there. Now, renewable energy comes in many forms, from solar, wind, biomass and geothermal, to mention just a few. It is also a labor-hungry industry and would appear a perfect fit to combat high levels of unemployment and also mitigate against climate change. A discussion on renewable energy after the break. Welcome back to Capital Connection. The renewable energy sector provides clean energy, is a jobs multiplier and gives countries energy independence. What is there not to like about the sector? But then how enthusiastic are African governments about embracing the new technologies? Joining us to discuss renewable energy is in Nigeria, Victor Eromosele, who is the CEO of ME Consulting, and in South Africa, energy analyst Chris Yeland. Victor, allow me to begin with you. Why isn't there a quick enough uptake by African governments to embrace renewable energy?
I guess that's a very tough question. It's a tough question because you have two types of Africa. You have what I call the high-speed Africa and then the low-speed Africa. High-speed Africa will include places like Morocco, even South Africa. You know, they're doing big things in renewable energy, which makes Africa proud. I mean, we're, for example, proud that we have 3 airports in South Africa that all have solar panels, and that's going the proper way. In Morocco, too, I mean, they are very good. They have this, one of the largest CSP power plants in the world. That is extremely good. Of course, then there's the slow-speed Africa. Nigeria, of course, will be in the slow-speed Africa when it comes to renewable energy. There's quite a lot, potentially, that we could be doing. Recently, we had 14 utility-scale contracts signed, and I can tell you that only 1 or 2 of those projects are actually getting out of the drawing board. So that is actually worrying. Why is that the case? I think there are many reasons actually responsible for that. Some people think, oh, renewable energy, solar is expensive. I don't think necessarily it's expensive. At least it's still much more cheaper than having darkness all around. And there's quite a lot of darkness in parts of Africa, I must say.
No,
So
for sure.
I think most of it has to do with awareness. And once the awareness comes, and I'm glad the awareness is coming pretty fast now, and I do hope there will be a huge uptick in terms of renewable energy.
I mean, because electrification is a major problem, or the lack thereof rather, on the continent. But also climate change is equally as disturbing for African economies. And Chris, if I just ask you, I mean, should many African countries continue to be relying on the old technology, such as your coal and your fossil fuels, especially as climate change is a major problem for the continent?
Yeah, my belief is strongly that the continent needs to look seriously and more closely at the benefits of renewable energy. And when I'm talking about renewable energy, I'm really talking about things such as wind power, solar PV, hydroelectric, and geothermal, and to a lesser extent, biomass. The big problem in Africa, certainly sub-Saharan Africa, is a quite poor infrastructure, roads and access, and long distances across a difficult and hostile territory. This has meant that the uptake of large centralized generation and large transmission grids has really failed in sub-Saharan Africa, other than perhaps in South Africa. And I think there are so many opportunities now to leapfrog this old traditional technology and move to distributed generation that is situated close to the customer. And this can vary from a single home solar system through to microgrids and mini grids for villages, towns, and areas that are not interconnected right across the country. And this means that these mini-grids and microgrids can be installed locally where there is the need, without the need for these very expensive transmission grids and expensive centralized generation, which is usually coal. So I think the combination of wind, solar PV, hydro, geothermal, where it is available, really makes for great opportunities at the right cost. And the important thing is that they can be built flexibly and quickly compared to the large mega projects. And they also, of course, have huge environmental benefits and climate change benefits.
For sure. And, you know, specifically for oil-dependent countries like Nigeria, Victor, surely moving further into the renewable space will increase its energy independence. And surely, I mean, governments like Nigeria that is trying to diversify its dependence away from oil, this is a route that they should be walking on a lot quicker.
I guess there's quite a lot that can be done in that respect, in terms of diversifying away from oil. Actually, the truth is that people see renewable energy in one compartment and oil and gas in another. The truth is that they're not. What we really need is a complete mix, and one augmenting the other. Once you have a situation where one augments the other, that I think is very good for Africa. And in Nigeria, that's what we should be looking at, a mix of energy. And Nigeria is actually very blessed. We have the ocean, so there's a lot of hydro. We have lots of rivers, so there's potential for hydro, because hydro is actually a very good form. And in Nigeria, there's the development of Mambila, which will be one of the biggest such hydro plants in Africa. We're quite happy about that, and that is going forward courtesy of the Chinese. And then you equally have these big utility scale plants. And if these things all come together and there's a convergence, which I see happening in the next 2 to 3 years, then definitely you'll see that there'll be an upsurge where you have a mix of both oil and gas resources on the one hand, and other forms of renewable energy, in particular hydro and solar. But wind I think we're not yet up to speed in wind. We just have at least one plant in Nigeria that is that was on stream last year. We will still need, there's plenty of wind in Nigeria, particularly around the oceans. So there's quite a lot of potential. I think the willpower that is really lacking. Once the willpower comes, I guess the governments will all wake up and see that really this is the way forward, particularly that the cost of renewable energy, whether it's wind or it's solar, the unit cost has gone down every year in the last decade or more.
Sure.
And that is something good. And there's now cost parity between conventional fossil fuel, which we need less of because it pollutes and all that. It's not good for climate, as well as then you now move on to renewable energy, which actually is good.
Sure. I mean, staying on the issue of policy, Chris, to what degree is policy perhaps holding us back from exploiting the opportunities of renewable energy? And I ask this because just last week here in South Africa, the draft integrated resource plan was tabled for public commentary. I mean, what did you make of it?
Well, of course, the regulatory and policy environments vary from country to country.
Sure.
So, you know, that as a factor holding back the continent, I would say it varies. But certainly in South Africa, if we look to South Africa, the regulatory environment, the policy environment has in fact delayed renewable energy at least for the last 3 years. So we started with a major renewable energy program, utility scale program, about 6 or 7 years ago, 8 years ago, and great progress was made until 3 years ago when the entire process was stopped in its tracks, when our national utility, Eskom, refused to sign further power purchase agreements, and there are various reasons for that. And this has really slowed up the uptake of utility scale renewable energy very significantly, and has caused great disruption, loss of momentum. Factories that were started to manufacture solar PV panels and wind turbines had to close down because of this 3-year complete absence of any orders. Now we've seen that the process is restarting again, and hopefully we will get back into the swing of things as 27 IPP projects have been signed off. But there's another aspect that's holding us back, and that is not in the utility scale, but it's in the domestic, commercial, and industrial application of solar rooftop PV, where there is regulatory uncertainty, and we are waiting with bated breath for the new so-called small-scale embedded generation regulations, which should be promulgated sometime this year. But this is really holding things back. By not having these regulations in place, the regulatory and policy framework is seriously holding back the rooftop solar PV business in what we call the behind-the-meter applications. These are applications on the roofs of houses and of factories and of parking lots and warehouses. And at the moment, people cannot install these systems. They are, to some extent, just going ahead doing it willy-nilly without the regulations, but the lack of regulations is definitely holding things back significantly.
All right, so regulation being another headwind. But Victor, for you, how do you see the outlook for the continent, especially in its attempts to get more and more people on the grid if we don't embrace renewable energy fast enough?
I think embracing renewable energy fast enough will remain a challenge for a while, but I think it will move a lot faster than it is now. The gentleman just talked about regulation. In Nigeria, for example, the regulation has been tortuous, but it's been improving by the day. And I do see that if these regulations are actually put to use, for example, any power generated, including rooftop, mini-grids, below 1 megawatts, that's a nearly unregulated terrain, which means it's outside the radar, so to say, and therefore there's a lot of potential at that level. And we don't, between the rurals, for example, and the urban, we see lots of traction in urban, in Nigeria, than you find in rural. For example, urban rooftop solar, or what you call the home systems, are thriving. I have, for example, a few solar panels on my rooftop, and therefore I get 24/7 electricity. Many middle-class Nigerians want to have that. That way, they ensure that whenever the conventional sources of electricity is not available, they do have it. But that's not true of those rurals. Very few rurals can afford it. And there have been experimental mini-grid schemes in several states of Nigeria that have been very successful, supported by the UN. We do expect the authorities should piggyback on that and grow mini-grids throughout Nigeria. But the good news now is that I think the World Bank is putting quite a lot of money, $340 million or thereabout, and a significant proportion of that is actually dedicated to mini-grids in rural areas. And specific locations have been chosen throughout Nigeria for such developments, and they are working hard at that. So we do hope in the next couple of years, when all these initiatives all converge, then there will definitely be progress, and we'll be moving in the right direction in Nigeria.
Well, gentlemen, thanks so much for your insights. That is all we have time for today. Thank you once again to my guests. And you can join us once again on Capital Connection on Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. Good night.